So, U.S. naval and Coast Guard assets, including aircraft, appear to be shadowing and closely monitoring Russian warships as they transit past Florida's eastern seaboard towards a port of call in Cuba. Now, the U.S. Coast Guard vessel, the C.G. Stone, as well as U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Truxtun and the USS Donald Cook, appear to be following the Russians. The U.S. vessels are accompanied by a Royal Canadian Navy frigate, the HMCS Ville de Quebec. Now, these ships were observed heading south along Florida's coastline, likely tracking the Russian fleet as it floats to Cuba. A U.S. Navy P-8 Alpha Poseidon and a Canadian CP-140 Aurora aircraft were also spotted in the vicinity conducting surveillance operations. The Russian naval group heading to Cuba includes the Gorshkov frigate, the nuclear-powered submarine called the Kazan, the fleet's oil tanker, the Pashin, and a rescue tug. These were all confirmed by Havana's foreign ministry, as this type of thing is not a secret. Russian state news stated the flotilla is expected to arrive in Cuba by tomorrow. Now, the Pentagon stated Russia's deployment of combat vessels to the Caribbean, including possible stops in Cuba and Venezuela, is part of their routine operations and does not pose a direct threat to the U.S. Additionally, Russian naval visits to Cuba are quite common and occurred annually from 2013 to 2020. Now, recently, this is becoming more difficult. There are financial and logistical constraints on Russia because of their war in Ukraine, and their fleet is frankly aging at this point. But Russia wants to be seen as a global naval power, so they periodically do conduct floats into what is essentially the US's backyard. But there is a broader geopolitical context here that obviously has to be considered, and that is Vladimir Putin has warned NATO countries against supporting Ukraine with Western weapons and saying he has a right to respond similarly by enhancing air defense systems and potentially giving weapons to regions where Western countries might have vulnerabilities. And this could include Cuba, obviously. So because Putin said these things, I've been seeing a lot of Russian shills on Twitter telling Americans that the game is over. Cuba is now getting Russian nuclear weapons. The US has lost. It is no longer a global power. Russia is on the rise. Dollar dominance is over. Pretty please buy Bitcoin. All of this due to the potential nuclearization of Cuba. Well, this is all misguided for multiple reasons. First of all, Russia has stated broadly that it would only move conventional weapons to our enemies, like we have done to Ukraine. Now, setting aside that Putin is actually finally admitting Ukraine is the enemy, Russia does not want to deploy nuclear weapons to Cuba, and here is why. First of all, there are still sanctions available to the U.S. There is wiggle room, including what is basically the kill button. The U.S. issuing a broad embargo on all Russian energy with automatic secondary sanctions to countries that violate it. Also, Putin doesn't want to be embarrassed by challenging a historical precedent and losing, and I'm specifically talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, it led to a near-catastrophic confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Back then, the US and the Soviet Union were closer to peers. They definitely are not now. The US is a global superpower. It is the only one. Russia is a regional peer competitor to Poland. Russia does not want to elicit further responses that will lead the US Congress to support Ukraine even more. Currently, the US does not have missiles in Europe, and such a move by Russia to deploy missiles to Cuba could change that. Right now, the US only has B-61 gravity bombs in Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Russia moving missiles to Cuba would likely set off a response in kind, possibly even a US deployment of them to Poland. And such a move would also trigger a broader arms race that Russia already knows it would lose, and an arms race that China may not be interested in watching take place, so they may pull back on Russia's leash because China does not want to see a stronger, more United States come to fruition because Russia is threatening it directly. The bottom line is the US has a greater capacity to arm Russia's neighbors than Russia does to arm Cuba. Poland, Japan, the Baltic nations all come to mind in a scenario where an arms supply race becomes very dangerous for Russia. And finally, the reality is Russia doesn't need to arm Cuba with nuclear weapons when they can float nuclear-capable submarines underwater outside of the 24-mile contiguous zone anywhere off the US coast, including off the coast of New York, off the coast of DC, doesn't matter. It is all perfectly legal. So saying Russia floating to Cuba is this end-all for the US, that's just silly. It ignores the fact that Russia has done it annually for years, and Russia is already selling weapons to Cuba, so such deployments are not a secret to anyone. Nonetheless, no matter what they say, Russia does not want a direct conflict with the US, so they may skirt the line that triggers such an event, but they're very careful not to cross it.